This is Totally True book. Totally True is used basically for younger kids, teenager 4 to 13 years old, for reading, basically for reading comprehension, speaking practice, and vocabulary building. For those students who are aged 4 to 10, we use it starting. A Totally True one is used for those who are GLJ 5. For 11 to 13, they're used for those with a level 3. Okay, now for teenagers, for older students and adults, you can also use them, but not focus more on reading comprehension, but on speaking practice, a little bit of vocabulary, and what? Debate,
Topic
if you need.
discussion.
So for topic discussion. So for 14 to 19, you start Totally True 1. Teka lang. Sinulat ko sana, no? But anyway, for 14 to 19, we start at GLJ 2. Oh, GL2, and then 20 and up. Actually, it's not part of the book list. But if can you believe it, or idioms and phrases are too difficult for the student, you could move down to Totally True. Okay, for discussion, reading comprehension, and vocabulary. Now, Totally True book it basically looks like this. Okay. First, you start off with the story. So what you do, you can ask the student to read the story, and then you discuss the meaning of the story or the gist of the topic. And then if you could notice, there are some words in bold letters. Those are the words, those are the vocab, that's vocab practice for students. So maybe those are the words they wouldn't know, but there might also be some words in the story that they do not know. At least you add that to the new list of new words that they learn for the day. And then after that, there are exercises. These are for comprehension. So which action happened first, which next. And then from the list of the words that you studied earlier, this is vocabulary practice to know whether they remember and understand the vocab focus of the story. And then what you have to do with this part is this is retelling. Retelling the story, it means they fully understand the sequence of the actions. So what they do is they look at the pictures and then they make complete sentences out of the things that they see in the picture or the actions that they see in the pictures. So that would be this story. And then the third part is this is still about the story. So it's more of comprehension. But in my case, I usually skip this after they've done retelling using the pictures. Because the next part is not comprehension anymore, but rather opinion. So this is where the student would share experiences, ask questions related to the story, but also based on students' experience. And then you have word partnerships. So these are words that are usually used together. And then you have practice. After that, from the words that you studied earlier, you use them to complete another story, which is a little bit similar to the first one. Oaks.
Okay.
Okay.
Question.
So,
What if the words are too easy for the student? Would this book be applicable even if the student likes the story but the words are too easy?
if the words are too easy, actually, in my case, personal opinion, it still depends on the student. If the words are too easy, you could and the student likes the book, you could stick to the book and give alternative expressions or synonyms. Or you could shift to a higher book because Totally 1, 2, and 3, the layout, they're all the same. But the degree of difficulty for the vocab part, it becomes more difficult as the book levels up. So it depends on, I think it would be better if you showed one story and another level or another book to the student because basically the stories are more or less the same, just the degree of difficulty of the words. Okay.
Yeah, yeah.
So how you go about with this book, I'm going to tell you how I go about with the book. Okay, so what I usually do is I ask the student to read it. No, first part of the story is picture description. So you ask the student what he can see in the picture, and you make complete sentences from there. If the student gives you phrases, you try to guide the student into making complete sentences. After that, let your student read the title and try to guess. This is the picture, and this is what the title of the story is. Do you think you can guess what the story is about? Then after that, you find out whether the student's guess is correct or not. And then, yes, I ask my student to read the story. I do not usually interrupt unless they just mispronounce something. Then, after that, I ask the student whether he understood the story. We go over the comprehension part. Sometimes I try to do retelling. And during retelling, that's where I also insert these words. So, for example, when the student reads, or sometimes when it's hard for the student to comprehend, I retell the story, rephrase it in simple ways. Okay, before you start with the vocabulary. So I try to focus on comprehension first, and then after comprehension, after the student has understood what has happened in the story, I go over the words. So let's say, for example, after the meeting, Scott still had his name tag on, and what did he do? He went out. Do you understand the meaning of went out? Then ask the student to explain that to you or give an example. Okay. So I don't do this part one by one. I go through comprehension and vocab at the same time. But it's still up to you. Sometimes, because some of the expressions are too easy, you can just ask your student to give examples or to explain them. Or also in my case, since I already know, I have an idea of what my students can and cannot understand. I just choose the words that I think are unfamiliar and then try to discuss the meanings of those words with them. Then
Yeah, but
actually
maybe
I
we can
don't do
also
this anymore.
incorporate the questions here instead of skipping that. After the reading part, maybe you can ask this part for the
Possibly,
comprehension.
yes. And the way I try to ask in comprehension, okay, I'll go back to the first page. Comprehension part is when I try to, for example, I try to ask the student to retell the story. I start it first. So, for example, there's Scott Ginsburg, and he's 23. He has a job, and then in his job, he had to attend a meeting, and in the meeting, he had to put on a name tag. And the name tag says, "Hello, my name is Scott." And after the meeting, what did Scott do? So it's incorporating the questions here, here, with review of comprehension. So it's like guiding your student to retell the story by asking questions. So let's say the student would answer, he went out, and where did he go? And when he went to the restaurant, what did he have on? And so when people there, when strangers, do you know strangers? Strangers are blah. So when strangers saw him with the name tag on, how did they react to it? So it's basically the same questions in the comprehension part on page 4. So maybe you could skip page 5. So you could probably skip that entirely since you already asked it on this page. So do you have any other suggestions on how to go about this page?
If the story is not that interesting for the student, maybe you can ask more of personal questions, like what would you do if you were in that restaurant and then you saw Scott? Would you say hi to him? Blah blah blah. So just in case the story isn't that interesting, or the story is like too short for them to dwell on, so maybe they can like you can ask questions even if it's not there. So another thing for the new words, instead of just reading them one by one, maybe you can choose, or maybe you can teach a different form. Like, for example, silence. Silence is a noun. Maybe you can change it to silence and then use that in a sentence.
Word family.
Yes, yes. So you can teach different word forms or even simple expressions.
I
So
suddenly have a
conversation or even
concern. What if the student, let's say the student didn't like the story, and or let's say you ask the student personal questions, but the student could not relate to the situation. How would
maybe
you
you
handle that
can
kind of student?
maybe you can uh, ask a different kind of situation. Like, for example, the what do you call this? This story is about meeting new friends or like introducing yourself or something like that. Maybe you can incorporate that, but in school, how about that? When you don't know anyone, what do you do to make new friends? Do you say hi, or do you wait for them to say hi at you first? Blah blah blah. So maybe it's still we can focus on making friends if the story is too complex for the student to relate to.
Okay. Actually, you can stretch this part into one whole class if you can. Because sometimes I think, like this one, in the retelling part, uh, you already hit this target.
Yeah, and I think this
So,
is good for the next class, just to check,
mm-mm.
just to
To
check.
check whether the student, remember, that's what I usually do. I use the whole thing for the whole class and even have, so we always have to remember the comprehension part and the opinion part, affective part. So we all, in my case, I try to focus more on the comprehension first, and after I'm sure that the student really understood the story, that's where I go to the affective part, and then ask the student about himself or about his experience or his reaction to the situation. And then in the next class, this is what I do for review. Or sometimes, or like this is what I use for review, or sometimes when the student is quite fast and it's easy for the student to understand, we finish until here.
Yeah.
From here, you can already
Yeah.
start giving follow-up questions so that you can save this part for the next class as a review. And this part could also be one whole class
Well,
as
yeah.
long as you have a lot of follow-up questions. Because the point of this book actually and this part of the book is to make your students share a lot. So uh, maybe there could be some people who just stick to the questions. As much as possible, I encourage tutors to understand the questions and try to rephrase them. So it's just like you're having very fluid conversation, but actually using the questions in the book.
Yeah, but it's better
It,
to modify the
yeah,
question than because they can read it themselves, so
that's why
it'll be
I
too
encourage
predictable.
in not just in this book, but in any kind of book where there are questions, put in a little bit of tutor input in it. Even the least that you can do is to rephrase your question, not ask the student to read the question or not read the direct question on the book. So let me ask you a question. For example, in this part, like about you, let me ask you a question. On weekends, what do you do? Do you like going out? Where do you usually go? I go to blah, 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 blah. How often do you go there? And when you're there, do you get to meet new people? So if you don't meet new people on weekends, can you think of another chance where you could, or another place where you could meet new people? And how do you meet them there? How do you start talking to them?
Is it
And for example, you
necessary?
have Nate. Hmm?
Is it necessary to connect the idea of the story,
No, that's just what
or
I do.
even if yeah? Ah, okay.
But it would be better because it's more coherent. But that's what I usually do. I connect one to another. I think it would be more fluid that way because they know that there already is a background in the first question, and then you can just easily connect it to the next question. So it's easy to skip to the next and to the next to the next if you try to connect them. Just
Okay.
my opinion. I don't know how you go about this part of the book.
Because it depends on the mood of the student. If the student likes to share a lot, then I let him or her
Hmm.
share it. But sometimes when the student is reluctant to speak, even say yes or no, they don't really react much. I tend to give them incomplete sentences. So
Hmm.
the problem with that is it becomes uh, more on question
Question and answer.
Q&A,
Yes.
but in a standard way. So how about that for non-responsive and non-cooperative students for that day only? How can they manage it? Do they need to skip it? Do they need to?
I think if you've already done the other parts and then you really want to let your because your focus is to let your student talk more. Sometimes if they don't have anything to share, you can try to open up a little bit and then they react to what you've experienced. You don't. It doesn't mean you monopolize the conversation. Just give the student an opening. Like in my case, blah 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 blah. So if you're, for example, you were me, what would you do? Because they have no experience to relate to. So that you try, since you're the ones talking, they would try to relate to your experience. That is if the student doesn't really respond at all. I mean, doesn't want to open up at all. But if in the case of non-responsive students when they don't really want to talk, I think the best thing to do is giving them incomplete sentences and just to have follow-ups of why and where and those just to expand the answer. And if they really don't want to add more, then you move on to the next question. At least you get a response in a way.
Yeah.
And then another thing that I encourage all the tutors, not just for this book, but for the other books, do not let your students read the instructions. And also do not use the direct instructions from the book. Okay, you just try to introduce the activity. You have to know the activity first and know the focus of the activity and give your own instructions as much as possible. So let's say, for example, this part, we have word partnerships, which means we use these words together. You don't need to use that.
Yeah.
Yeah, in all kinds of books. Try as much as possible to avoid using the direct instructions or the direct questions from the book because that you will not be giving in any of your own input to the class. And then sometimes when you teach word partnerships, the students already give you answers that could also be used here. It's either you use their answers or those answers, or you can ask the student to come up with other answers. At least that would be practice for them. And also in this part of the story, you could teach a little bit of grammar. Just the pattern, like go out to plus a place, go out to plus an to do, or route for plus a noun. At least in the pattern part, there's a little bit of grammar, or in this part that you teach a little bit of pattern or grammar. And then in here, there are some students who also do not respond well to this part. It depends on whether they like the topic or not. So also we try to go back to just completing sentences and maybe just asking a little bit of follow-up questions, and the student really doesn't appear interested, move on.
But maybe we can use the pictures. Like, what can we do at the park or at the restaurant? So if the student is responsive, then we can do that. But if the student isn't, then just proceed to the completion of the sentences.
Yeah, the problem is with non-responsive students most of the time. Because with those who participate a lot, you will have no problem at all in any book that you have.
Any book, yeah.
But especially here when it's a speaking class and they're supposed to speak most of the time, you really have to try and engage in the conversation. So sometimes what you have to do, you share your own experience, or you talk about something, or talk about it first before you ask them to talk about it, because they don't want to talk. So incomplete sentences, just make them complete those sentences. And the last part is, like, we have another story, but it's a little bit the same with Scott's story, or the story that we have on the first page. And we, as you can see, you have the same words. So we're going to use those words to complete the sentences, the story rather. And then after the student has completed the story, the way I guide my students is I either try to give them the definition that we studied, or when we give definitions, I also give synonyms. So sometimes they don't know the answer. I try to give the synonyms of the story, of the words, so they could guess the answer. Try as much as possible not to spoon feed your students, because tutors are not supposed to give the answer. They're just supposed to guide the students into coming up with the right answer. Although sometimes it's really quite hard. After trying many times and the students still couldn't get it,
Yeah.
you can actually skip because there's a list of words. So when they've used up
Mm.
some of the words and then you go back to something that they've missed, I
Yeah.
think it's the list is shortened and it's better, it's easier for them to pick.
Yes.
And
But
then the last,
most of the
yes.
times I just let them answer.
Mhm.
Just everywhere? No. Strangers?
Mhm.
Yes. So I just do that, and then after the entire story, I ask them, what do you think is the difference between say the story Say Hello and the story about Scott, or what
Mhm.
similarities do the stories have?
Sometimes this part is useful.
Yeah.
Oh, most of the time, this part is useful. So compare the two stories. That's correct. Compare the two stories, or sometimes, because here they sometimes put situations where, let's say, for example, Scott met Joel Vandermeer.
Mm.
What kinds of, oh, let's pretend I'm Joel Vandermeer, and then you're Scott. What do you think, or what do you think could you say to me, or what do you think are you gonna ask me? And then I also try to initiate. We don't use it in question and answer form. It's like, what would you say to? No, I really pretend to be one person, and I really ask the student to pretend to be the other person, and just have a conversation. So role playing, not just question and answer type.
Yeah.
It would be fun for some of the stories, although others may not be as interesting as some. But you can just choose. And always, you could come up with other ways to compare stories, actually. Always remember
It
that
could
we do
be
not
the
have a
setting.
standard. Mm.
Yes. It could be the setting, the character, or the situation that happened to them. Maybe we
Mm.
can choose from that, not just the characters, but also
Yes,
the
and
setting.
that kind of
Yes,
situation.
or the yeah.
For example, let's say you were at an elevator and you see someone with a name tag. Or on the elevator, you see the phrase say hello. And there are a lot of people there. So which do you think could have, or in which situation could you have more friends? Just like that.
Hmm.
Always remember that your creativity is your limit. So in as many ways as you can make use of the situation. You can come up with a lot of ways to make your students talk or practice the words that you've studied or the situations or the phrases that you've studied, I think. Anyway, so that's totally true.
Yeah,
And
one unit.
totally true 1. Actually, the same goes with totally true 2 and totally true 3. Now, speaking of conversation or speaking in conversation books or speaking in debate books, can you believe it is a lot like this one? The only difference between the two books is instead of having words, they use
Few words.
phrases and idioms.
Idioms.
So that's why Can You Believe It is just for higher level students, the same age range, the ones I've mentioned earlier, same age range, but for higher levels. Okay, just so it's clear, I'm just gonna try and write it down according to age levels. So let's say students 4 to 8, this is for reading and reading comprehension and, my gosh, reading comprehension and vocab, reading comprehension and speaking rather, and also a bit of vocab. Vocab. And it starts from level DL 5. For 11 to 13, focus is also reading comprehension, a bit of vocab, and speaking. And it starts at level 3. For 14 to 19-year-olds, this is for conversation and vocab. And this starts at level, is it GLS, GLA, T, T2, correct? And then the other one is for adults, so 20 and up. It's actually not on the book list, but it's also for speaking and vocab. Just try to think of it as easier than Can You Believe It? So if your students have a hard time with the Can You Believe It books, you go down to Totally True. Okay.
Okay.
I think that we have to wrap it up now. That's the end of it. So I think if you have no other suggestions, we have to say goodbye. Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Parang tanga lang.